In this video, we're assuming that the marginal costs of production increase. So for example, if it costs $12 to make the 8th good, it might cost $12.03 to make the 9th good, and $12.50 to make the 10th good. So as you produce more and more, the cost of making the next unit goes up. Increasing marginal costs is the default assumption in economics. It's what economists usually assume, and the deep reason is that it usually makes our models work out because it causes the calculus second-order conditions to work. But to justify it based on reality, you can tell basically two stories. One is that workers bumping into each other. That if you have a factory and you want to produce more, you hire more workers, but those workers bump into each other, so each new worker isn't as productive as before. Another story is that as you increase production, you've got to use lower and lower quality resources. This story works really well if you've got farmland. So imagine you've got a whole bunch of farmland and you're not using very much of it, and you decide to grow carrots. Well, you're going to pick the absolute best land for growing carrots. So you grow some carrots, and then you say, no, I actually want to grow more carrots. Well, now you're going to have to pick land that's not quite as good. It's going to be more costly to grow these carrots. Maybe you got to put in an irrigation system or pull out weeds. And then as you keep growing more and more carrots, you keep devoting more and more of your land to carrot production, you got to put into place lower quality land, and that's going to be more expensive. Or for every unit of labor you use, you're going to get less output, which means it's basically the cost per output's going to go up. And in general, if even abstracting away from farming, as a firm chooses to do something, it's going to use the lowest hanging fruit. It'll find the best workers it can for the price it's willing to pay. Then as it expands production, it's got to say, oh, we got to go dip down into the labor market. We're willing to pay $20 an hour. We got the best $20 an hour employees we could, and now we've got to get employees who aren't quite as good. Or we've got to, we've used this great resource we used a supplier. It was really helpful, but we've used them as much as we can. Now we've got to go to a supplier that isn't quite as useful. So as you expand, you often have to make choices that aren't quite as good as they were before, because you're a bit more desperate because you've already picked the best opportunities, and now you've got to start getting worse and worse opportunities. So these are the stories economists tell to justify increasing marginal costs, although we don't assume increasing marginal costs apply to every industry. Increasing marginal costs give us a U-shaped average total cost curve. Let me say that again. This is going to be really important in later sections. Increasing marginal costs give us basically a U-shaped average total cost curve. So remember, average total cost is how much on average it costs you to make a unit of output. And when marginal costs are increasing and you've got some fixed costs, you'll tend to have a U-shaped average total cost curve. Now, the reason is average total costs are going to be very high when you have low output because of your fixed costs. If you imagine, you make a movie and you spend $1 million and one person sees it. Well, on average, it costs you $1 million for that one viewer. Suddenly you get 2 viewers. Now it only costs you $500,000 per viewer. If you have 10 viewers, it's $100,000 per viewer, and it's going to fall a lot. You buy $1 million of farmland, you grow 1 carrot. Well, boy, you spent a lot of money per carrot on the fixed costs of the farmland. You grow 10 carrots, and it goes down a lot. So when you have very small levels of output, your fixed costs aren't spread out among a lot of people. So you're going to have really high average total costs due to your fixed costs not being spread out among a lot of people. So, or imagine with software, you build software and you spend $100,000 in the software, but if only 2 or 3 people buy the software, man, your average costs per user are enormous. Then as output increases, the fixed cost component, the average fixed costs go down. So how the contribution of fixed cost to your high average total cost, that's not as important because your fixed costs get spread out among more and more people. But then the increasing marginal cost starts to come into play. So if you assume you have increasing marginal costs, eventually that's going to make it very expensive on average to make goods. So let me translate this into a potato farmer. So you buy $1 million worth of land to plant potatoes. You plant one potato, that's going to be a really expensive potato for you to make because you spent the $1 million on the fixed costs in the farmland, right? You plant more and more potatoes, and the $1 million that gets spread out among more and more potatoes. Now, when you plant your first potato, you pick the best land you can that you own for potatoes. As you start planting more and more potatoes, you're getting to lower and lower quality land. And eventually you're incurring some really high cost to plant these potatoes. Maybe you've got to clear rocks, or you're putting in irrigation systems, or you have to fertilize it really carefully, or you're carefully making sure predators don't get it because some area is exposed. So it gets really, really expensive. And then you start to extremes. You want really high output on your land. You're building buildings and you're putting dirt on different floors to grow potatoes, and it's getting ridiculously expensive. So to review, when you have substantial fixed costs and increasing marginal costs, the average total cost curve will tend to have a U-shaped. It'll be high for low levels of output because of the high average fixed cost component of average total costs. And it'll be high for high levels of output because of the very high marginal costs when output gets to be substantial. When we talk about perfect competition, it's going to be important to understand that when you graph the average total cost curve and the marginal cost curve on the same graph, that the marginal cost curve goes through the low point on the average total cost curve. So again, the marginal cost curve is going to go through the low point on the average total cost curve if you have a U-shaped average total cost curve and increasing marginal costs. The reason is actually purely because of mathematics, not because of economics. If you have any average and an increasing marginal, then that marginal is going to have to go through the low point on the average if you've got a U-shaped average. Right. To explain why, let me use an example with your average grades. So here's a fact. You've been taking a bunch of exams, and your grade on the past tests have been 80. You take another exam and you get a 90. Now we know that your new average is higher. We don't know how much higher because we don't know how many exams you've taken in the past. But clearly, if your average on a bunch of past tests is 80, and you take a new exam and your grade on this new exam is a 90, your new average is higher. Generalizing, if your marginal is greater than your average, your new average is higher. So think of all your exams, and your marginal exam is your last one. Marginal is next, or the last one. So if your marginal exam grade is greater than your average exam grade, then your new average is higher. Your average must be going up, right? If your last exam grade is higher than the past averages, your average has to be moving up. So to review from last slide, if marginal is greater than average, then average has to be rising. That's contradicted by this diagram. So let's imagine I said, well, maybe the marginal cost curve doesn't go through the low point on the average total cost curve. Maybe it goes to the left of the low point. Maybe it intersects at a point way to the left. Well, if what you saw before you, if that were true, then that would imply that there's an area where the marginal cost curve is above the average total cost curve, but the average total cost curve is falling. This is mathematically impossible. So the diagram before you cannot happen if you've got marginal and averages. This is like saying, well, you got, your last exam was higher on average than what you got before, but your new average is lower. Right? Can you imagine your teacher said, yes, well, you got a 90 on this exam and your past average was an 80, but just somehow it worked out. Your new average is now a 79. No, that can't happen. That's just not allowed by the laws of mathematics. So generalizing, it can't be that the marginal cost curve intersects the average total cost curve to the left like it is in front of you, because that would imply that we've got a marginal above an average, but the average is falling. Now, no, because whenever the marginal is above an average, the average has to be rising. Let's consider the opposite case. Let's say your average grade on the past test was an 85, but you take another exam and you get a 70. Well, now your average has to be falling. Again, we don't know how much because we don't know how many exams you took in the past. But your old average is an 85. You take a new exam and you get below an 85. Your average is now below 85. Generalizing, if your marginal is below your average, your new average is lower, right? You take the exams. Your marginal, your last exam, is below the average. Well, your average is going down. Well, the fact that if marginal is below average, your average has to be falling, that shows that it's impossible to have a diagram like is in front of you, where marginal cost curve intersects the average total cost curve at a point to the right of the low point of the average total cost curve. See, if you look here, there's an area marked where marginal is below average, but somehow the average is rising. So that would be like saying, well, yeah, your average exam grade, it'd been an 85, and you took a new test and you got a 70, but now somehow your average is now an 87. No. Again, mathematics, that's strictly prohibited by what we understand by what average means. So this is impossible. So if you've got a marginal cost curve that's kind of just going right up, and you've got a U-shaped average total cost curve, we've shown that the marginal cost curve can't intersect to the left of the low point of the average total cost curve, and it can't intersect to the right of the low point of the average total cost curve. What it can do is intersect right in the center, and if you do that as an exercise, you could go and you could see how when the marginal cost curve is above the average total cost curve, and the average total cost curve is rising, and when the marginal cost curve is below the average total cost curve, the average total cost curve is falling. You should see that both facts happen for all points on the average total cost curve. I know it's not at all obvious why I'm doing this, but this gets to be very important when you talk about perfect competition. There's a model of perfect competition, and there's going to be an average total cost curve and a marginal cost curve, and you're going to need the marginal cost curve to go through the low point on the average total cost curve, and it's going to end up giving you a really, really important result that is probably taught in pretty much every intro micro class. Now I want to give one practical example of a U-shaped average total cost curve coming from increasing marginal costs. And this is the Malthusian Trap. So Thomas Malthus, he was a social scientist, and he had this idea that eventually people are going to be starving to death. And the reason is, I don't think he used the language of increasing marginal costs, but you can translate into that. His view was that, well, agriculture is basically subject to diminishing returns. That is, the population of a country goes up, what's going to happen? Well, the new people are going to be farming lower quality land, and eventually they're going to not be able to grow enough food to sustain themselves. So that means in the long run, people are eventually going to starve to death. His view was, you've got two kinds of countries. In one kind of country, population isn't growing because starvation is a check. He existed in Thomas Malthus was a 19th century guy, so this was really before birth control was used. And if the population isn't growing, he thought it's probably because people are starving to death. If a population is growing, maybe for a while they've got plenty of food. Maybe it's a case where you conquered another country and you took their land, or it was like the New World where you go and you wipe out the existing population and then you've got a whole bunch of land to farm. But as the population size increases, well, eventually people are going to farm land of such low quality that the new farmers won't be able to feed themselves, and people eventually starve to death. So the Malthusian Trap is really a depressing prediction. It's saying even if you have a country that's doing well, eventually it's they're going to have too many people, and the people won't be able to find enough land to feed themselves, enough quality land to feed themselves on, and so starvation is going to be the ultimate check on the population. And this is some really big public policy implications. I mean, you can, for example, argue against welfare. Let's say right now you have a society where there are poor people who can't afford to feed themselves. But, if you taxed the rich a little bit and gave the money to the poor could feed themselves, and the rich still. They wouldn't like having to pay the poor money, but, everyone could feed themselves. Well, you can use the argument of the Malthusian Trap to say, no, it's a bad idea. Because if we, let we stop the poor from starving to death now, then what will happen is they'll have more kids, and eventually starvation will be a check. You can imagine an analogy where there's rabbits in a field. There's a closed off field and there's a bunch of rabbits, and you come and you see them and you notice one day, oh gosh, the rabbits that can't get enough to eat in this field. I know, I'll bring them some apples. So every day you give them some apples. And that's fine for a while, but then you just wait a minute, the population of rabbits has just gone up a little bit more. Oh, I better bring more apples. So you do that, but then it keeps going up, and eventually, right, you're not going to win. Eventually the rabbits are going to starve to death. So the end effect of you giving those few apples to the rabbits is that there'll be more rabbits who will eventually starve to death. Now, the important thing about the Malthusian Trap is that it really hasn't worked out. We have more food now per person than ever before. In the United States, at least, we actually have less farmland under production than we used to. There's a lot of farmland in New England that just isn't used anymore. What's happened is technology. That technology has defeated the Malthusian Trap. That we've just gotten so much better at growing stuff. We've got better fertilizer, better tractors, better irrigation systems, smarter, better, and educated farmers. That even though the world population is growing, our ability to grow food is outpacing this. So we're really not facing diminishing marginal returns. We're not facing increasing marginal costs in the agricultural sector worldwide. Now, can we continue this? Well, obviously not forever. If the population of Earth keeps growing to infinity, eventually, couldn't physically be enough atoms to feed everybody. But, it could potentially go on for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. It really depends on what happens to our technology. Are we able to keep creating better technology so we can grow more food on the same land? Thank you for listening today.